Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dhruva Jayashankar. I'm a fellow for foreign policy here at Brookings India. On behalf of Brookings India, welcome. This is one of many events that we have lined up for the next few days and weeks. We have some more details on this document here, which is flying around on some of our forthcoming events. We have one, in fact, 1 week from today, a panel discussion on the US elections and the implications for India, so I hope you can join us for that. But we have a very exciting topic and exciting couple of speakers here who will be joining us. And the topic being rising democracies, 5 rising democracies, and the implications for the international order. One of those democracies, of course, is India. So we'll be spending a lot of time discussing that. But of course, the others are just as interesting, just as complex. Turkey, South Africa, Indonesia, and Brazil. I hope there are no Brazilians here and I'm not offended anyone by it. But to discuss the subject, we have Ted Picone, who is a senior fellow in the Project of International Order and Strategy and the Latin America Initiative in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings in Washington, D.C. Ted served previously at the U.S. National Security Council staff, at the State Department's Office of Policy Planning, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. From 2001 to 2008, he was the Executive Director and co-founder of the Democracy Coalition Project. He was also the Washington Office Director of the Club of Madrid, and he's written a book which he will be talking about on 5 rising democracies and the implications of the international order. Also joining us is Lata Reddy, and we're very privileged to have her. Lata Reddy is the former Deputy National Security Advisor of India. She had a long and storied career in the Indian Foreign Service, and she served as India's ambassador to Portugal and to Thailand. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ted, who will speak for about 20 minutes or so, and draw your attention to the PowerPoint presentation here. And following that, we'll have a discussion involving all 3 of us. So thank you again for joining us.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you especially, Ambassador Reddy, for coming and joining us for this conversation. I'm going to try to very briefly give you an overview of what is a very complex subject about 5 very complex countries, as Dhruva mentioned. And then we'll look forward to the conversation. So I'm going to run through some slides, but I'm not going to really dwell on them, and I'm going to skip over several of them. But in essence, what I'm trying to handle and address with this book that just came out is, will shifting global power balances in the world help or hinder the basic fundamental demands for human rights and democracy? Polls around the world show very high public support for democracy, but surveys also show very high levels of dissatisfaction with its performance. So democracy is by no means consolidated, and even in established democracies, we see some real challenges and threats to basic questions of how governments behave. And I argue that the answer depends very much on the role of 5 rising powers, India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, and Indonesia, both as examples of change, of progressive change, and also for the example they provide to the rest of the world being particularly important. So this little chart shows you that these 5 countries represent about 25% of the world's population. Fairly significant portion, and if you add the remaining electoral democracies, which is 31%, you have a clear majority of the world being electoral democracies. Why did I pick these 5 countries? All 5, and I'm going to say right up front, there's a big exception. When I started this research 5 years ago, Turkey looked very different. And in the last 5 years, Turkey has clearly faced a number of challenges and has been backsliding. So that's my big caveat for this whole presentation. But as you'll see, there are some interesting stories to tell about Turkey. But all 5 have largely made These leap from illiberal governance and closed economies to more open and accountable systems. These are highly diverse societies, which I think underscores the universality of liberal norms. This is not just a Western concept or practice. This is being practiced in very diverse societies from every region of the world. All five really have made impressive gains in responding to popular demands for change. And I'll go through that very quickly. And I think proves the point that you can have both democratic political reform and progress and socioeconomic growth and improvements. Now, all five also want a greater say in the international system. But when it comes to promotion of liberal values, it's a very mixed record. So that's why, and these are just some of the iconic figures that have been involved in the history of these five and the turning points that I analyzed in which a clear choice was made toward further opening of either economies or political systems or both. So that's why I chose 1991 for India, when a slew of economic reforms were adopted here to open the Indian economy to the rest of the world. The others tend to be more political, but also economic changes. And these milestones, as you can see, are only in the last 20 years, so it's still relatively young. So, not surprisingly, with that kind of change, you see significant improvements in political freedoms and civil rights. But more recently, this is Freedom House data, you also see stagnation and decline. So even before, this is through 2014, the recent events in Turkey, in the initial, all of this is since the periods of transition, Turkey did show improvements, but if you continue that out beyond 2013, you would show further decline. In terms of economic growth, really dramatic success. GDP per capita rose. That's what this particular graph shows. You have volatility of economic change decreasing, so a smoother path. Also inflation decreasing, which has an important effect on the poor. But you also saw unemployment rising and inequality rising. And in response, many of these democratic governments, democratically elected governments, expanded social benefits and widened the social safety net, and that had some predictable results. Also, these economies became much more integrated into the global system, much greater South-South trade and foreign direct investment. And many of these countries also became donors, particularly in humanitarian assistance, but also foreign aid and loans. Now, the next slide is the most striking to me, that all five of these countries made dramatic progress in terms of human development. This is an index that the UN Development Program has tracked for many, many years, and all of them, since their transitions to more open systems, continued on a path of improvements in human development. And this includes dropping poverty, improvement in life expectancy, infant and maternal mortality declined, literacy rates went up, you see more students in school at higher levels, including women and girls, and greater access to better drinking water, which is fundamental to health across the board. So this is a fairly remarkable record of progress. And I think it proves the point that you can do two things at the same time. You can have both economic and human development and political development. These countries have performed above the global average in GDP growth rates, in progress toward the Millennium Development Goals, and they've earned some soft power in the international system as attractive examples of how to go about doing this. And I would say, in contrast to some other countries, including China, has argued, no, you can't do both at the same time. And the question is left, well, how are these countries going to use this soft power in the international scene? And will these more recent trends that we know about will clip their wings on the global stage? I'm not going to go into this. I think we all know generally what we mean by the international liberal order. We do have, I would argue, a fairly complex web of democracy and human rights protections that are baked into the international system, and also in other mechanisms we use to address human development and peace and security. That shows that we've actually come a long way in the last 50 years, and I think we've come enough of a way that we need to actually think hard about protecting it and strengthening it, and that's why I think these states play such an important role. The thing is that many of these countries that I'm studying have not fully bought into this international system. It is perceived as dominated by the West and the United States in particular. And they don't like certain aspects like coercive action, sanctions, use of force, particularly when it's directed at political regime change. And this has been a real cleavage between North and South on how to go about strengthening the international liberal order. They also, of course, point out that the so-called developed democracies are not so developed as they may appear and have their own problems. Let's skip ahead here. In essence, these are swing states that still hold on to traditional concepts of sovereignty and narrow definitions of national interest that really trump democratic peace and liberal internationalism. Their own histories of colonialism, apartheid, military dictatorships that were supported by the West skew them against joining this order the way it's currently perceived. They also don't want to the international scrutiny that comes with a more robust international system of monitoring of democracy and human rights standards. You have to point out in particular two examples in the recent past in which these issues really became dividing lines. One, of course, was Iraq, where the overthrow of Saddam Hussein was cast as a democracy promotion, which was a disaster in so many ways. And also the intervention in Libya, which was framed as responsibility to protect civilians, a new doctrine that all states accepted in 2005 at the big summit at the UN, but when it was applied in that particular case and coupled with use of force by NATO and ultimately the killing of Gaddafi and leaving in its wake a disaster, really left many people very much opposed to the idea of responsibility to protect, that it's been abused and manipulated for regime change purposes. So this has been a major setback to the international liberal order. And so many of these states, I would say, practice a form of liberal realism where they accept the basic norms of the international system, but not the means to defend them. And at the end of the day, they're most focused on strategic autonomy, maximum flexibility in dealing with all regimes of any type around the world. This is just a quick slide that I think it's also important to note that these countries also play important roles in their own regions with mixed effect and mixed intentions. But in particular, I'm interested in this choice between the BRICS, which is really has some teeth to it, I think, is building up institutions, and with the deep pockets of China putting real resources behind it, and is India, Brazil, South Africa, which at one point was meeting at senior levels, at the presidential head of state level, and since then has really been downplayed and downsized in its role. Of course, IBSA really wore its democratic identity on its sleeve and now is receding, I think, in any kind of profile. I also spend time in the book talking about the role of civil society because I think it's so interesting to see both national and transnational civil society getting organized and trying to influence countries, not only their domestic policies, but their foreign policies. And to some real effect in some cases. And there are some examples, both, of course, unfinished business, but really highlighting issues of protection of civilians, right to education, helping people who have been kidnapped by Boko Haram in Nigeria. But I also go into great detail in the book about many other examples in these countries where working with other activists around the world, having a real impact on changing government policy. In Brazil, just to give one example, working with activists from Iran and North Korea and putting them in front of the Brazilian public through the media, through Congress, and getting Brazil to change its voting at the UN on those issues. Of course, democracies do offer more points of influence and leverage for both domestic and foreign actors, and that's why they tend to have more attention by the international community. So, finally, the last section of the book, I talk about how would you get to some kind of consensus or cooperation on democracy and human rights issues. And I started very much with a more self-critical look at the way the United States has performed. And principally, the point is, practice what you preach. The United States is the champion rhetorically on a lot of these issues, but in practice has an incredibly checkered record. I pointed to Iraq, but there are many, many other examples. The experience around torture in particular, and the lack of accountability for documented cases of torture after 9/11 is a major stain on the U.S. record. The U.S. and others also need to understand better where these 5 countries are coming from on these issues, given their own history and their demands for a greater voice in global governance. And the big question is how do you get there when there are these doubts about what a revised order would actually look like in practical terms. I think there is an important role for regional organizations to play. My concern is that if they adopt standards that are significantly below the international UN norms, that you would have a weakening and a watering down of those international norms. A lot more can be done to build cross-regional coalitions of democracies. I've done a lot of work with the Community of Democracies, which is an initiative of this sort. India is an important member of this group. And also, India is a major contributor to the UN Democracy Fund, which supports all kinds of programs around the world to strengthen civil society and grassroots in their process of democratization. Of course, the important role of civil society in the media as watchdogs and as sources of good ideas. Actually, some government officials have been surprised, have told me they've been surprised by how much civil society contributes when the expectation is that they're going to be nothing but critics, but in fact they have a lot of constructive ideas to bring to the table. And to my surprise, very little action from legislatures on these issues, and a lot more could be done on that front. So finally, some ideas for specific topics that could serve as priorities for cooperation. And I point to some of these in part after a series of consultations I did in these countries, but also some of these are what I call lifeblood or empowerment rights that are fundamental to a whole set of other initiatives and rights. So if you're working on development issues in a rural area, if your organizations do not have the ability to organize and receive funding from other sources, then you've cut off a very important sector in delivering real positive change on the ground. So that includes access to information and freedom of the internet, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk more about that during the Q&A. Corruption is really rising as a major driver of political change and reform in all kinds of countries around the world, including here, but also Guatemala, certainly in Brazil. We need to talk for a minute about what's happening in Brazil, where you have both a political and an economic crisis. You have a political system that has and an economic model that may have run its course, and the massive corruption. And that's not me talking, that's Brazilians will tell you. The massive corruption that's being revealed is showing that that model is unsustainable. And the public is fed up with it, and it has direct impact on public services, on human rights, on security, and they want to see it cleaned up. And that's what's happening in Brazil right now. What's interesting, and why I'm more hopeful about Brazil, is that the institutions are responding in some very significant ways. You have independent prosecutors, you have judges and courts playing their role, and of course you have a free, robust media and civil society all pushing this forward. And I do give President Rousseff some credit for, in the initial stages, allowing these prosecutions to go forward. She now is not in power with awaiting impeachment trial. That remains to be seen where that goes. But I think overall, in the medium term, Brazil has a brighter horizon. So I think in conclusion, when I'm in a more optimistic frame of mind, I would say that these rising 5 countries minus Turkey are capable of becoming more active supporters of liberal norms, but on their own terms. And I think the West has a lot to learn from their own experiences and what they can bring to the table on a lot of these issues. I think there's still going to be a core constituency for counterbalancing the West as the initial reaction to how to construct policy. But it's not inevitable, and I think with some adjustments from the West, you would get a better result on ends versus means. I think the whole process of democratization of foreign policy, where you have more and more interest groups having a voice in foreign policy decision-making, that will continue. Because you see various trends around the role of media, social media, right to information laws that are making it more transparent how decisions are being made and more opportunities for influence. On the other hand, my final point is that this pressure of greater public participation cuts both ways. We all know that there are very strong, and I'm speaking very much from what's happening in the United States, very strong impulses of nationalism, xenophobia, that are being exploited by some of our politicians in some very ugly ways. So we are having our own illiberal moment, and hopefully it's just a moment, but it taps into a certain force in public that is not on board with the whole notion of globalization. And versus a more cosmopolitan approach, which I think we saw in ascendance for these past several years, which is really being pushed back. And I think that's the crossroads we're at right now, and we'll see where it plays out. And finally, an optimistic note, the Sustainable Development Goals out of the United Nations, which now obligates all states to make certain targets on development, includes issues of democracy, access to justice, accountability, and human rights that really marry our development agenda with our human rights agenda in some very important ways. And I think that's going to be, since a lot of money goes into development work, if we marry it up with democracy and human rights, we'll see some real progress. Sorry for going on so long, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ted. Thank you for setting the stage. There was a lot there. I have many questions. I'm sure many people in the audience have their own questions. But before turning to them and before discussion, I want to turn over to Ambassador Reddy. You heard Ted's presentation, and you've represented India in many forums in many ways, and on many of the issues that he discussed. What was some of your takeaways from that presentation and your thoughts on the broader subject of how rising democracies such as India will play a role in shaping the future international order?
Well, firstly, let me congratulate Ted on this book. And it's an interesting grouping of 5 countries, which is why I think it sort of captured the public imagination, because we don't normally see yes, you see in IPSA, you see India, Brazil, South Africa, but bringing Indonesia and Turkey into the equation, I think, was curious. Also, you know, you could raise questions like why not Mexico, why not Chile, but I did see in one write-up that you had mentioned that you did see other countries as beacons, I think was the word you used, in this sort of move towards an international liberal democratic order. But you didn't specifically focus on those countries, you focused on these five. I'm happy to see that you voluntarily removed Turkey from the list, and it's for obvious reasons. And which actually brings me to the first point I'd like to ask you, Ted. You published this book in December of 2015, if I'm not mistaken. And it was largely based, to a certain degree, on data up to 2014. And the things you had observed in these five countries, their evolution during the period pre-2015. So let's say, taking a broad view of what has happened in the last year or so, and I can see very clear issues of what has happened in each country. Turkey, I've already touched on, but just to refresh our memories, you know, we've had Erdogan's increasing authoritarianism, the refugee crisis with the millions pouring in from Syria, at the Istanbul airport attack, and recently the failed coup. And of course a lot of speculation about whether it really was a genuine coup attempt or not. And secondly, in Brazil you had the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. And Indonesia, I think basically the issue is, have they been hampered by ASEAN weaknesses that have surfaced over the South China Sea? Have they been held back because of the lack of progress in ASEAN and in regional structures? And have they really been able to emerge as a major rising power? In the case of South Africa, certainly the question of whether Zuma can be viewed as a liberal democratic leader, and the corruption issues, of course, and as you mentioned yourself, the legacy of apartheid. And India, you know, the question is, yes, your point that we have not assumed the leadership role or the regional leadership role that we should have in South Asia is very valid. And in the Raisina dialogue in April, for example, that was very much the theme, that why has South Asia not been able to come together and integrate? And there was a certain amount of responsibility which was, you know, which I think rightfully placed on India for not assuming the leadership role in that. And of course the rise of illiberal tendencies, the rise of nationalistic fervor, if you like, and you know, unfortunately some mediums on which I'd like to touch a little bit later, like the spread of social media, internet, trolling, all this has only intensified this sort of outpouring of illiberal sentiments without any means of censorship. And of course the very burning question of the moment of what is happening in Kashmir, you know, and how do we deal with these issues in a liberal democracy? So I think in each of these five countries you've got these problems, and many of them are of very recent origin, though they may have their roots in the past which you've analyzed. So my question is, what do you make of these recent developments? Has it altered your perception of the rising five?
If I can add a few, just two quick thoughts and a question, and have you answered them to get to other people. One, I mean, it struck me when you were comparing the five and your starting points for comparison. India is in fact an older democracy than the other four. India democratized in the 40s, 50s, it had its issues, but Indian democracy today is in some ways the product of a much longer evolution than Brazil and Indonesia, which were in the 80s and 90s, South Africa in the 90s again. And so I wonder if that actually differentiates India a little bit from the others. It's also interesting, I mean, I think we can, if you look around India's neighborhood, some of these examples are perhaps more recent than others, but there have been times when India has been quite aggressive in promoting democracy or liberal values in Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, Afghanistan, more recently Sri Lanka, Maldives, even one can say Pakistan and even Bhutan, in fact, and at least nudging these countries in that direction. It's not always been necessarily consistent. There's often reverse positions when certain interests have come in the way. But I wonder if that factors into your conception of India as a global actor. I have one question though that I would like to hear your answer to specifically, which is there's an undercurrent in your presentation that democratization leads to cosmopolitanism, or at least that there's a correlation between the two. And perhaps, would you say, given some of the recent developments that you've seen, and particularly in all of these countries, is there naturally and inevitably going to be a correlation between greater democratization and greater cosmopolitanism and globalization? But I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of the things, and then maybe we can open it up to discussion.
Great. Those are all great questions. So let me start with lots of these questions about why these five. First of all, democratization is a slow and complicated process with lots of ups and downs. So you're going to see steps forward and steps backwards. But I felt that, I thought when I chose these countries 5 years ago, they had each reached a certain tipping point that was going to lead toward more rather than less backward movement. So I did think that these five were irreversible. Now, as I said, I have major doubts about Turkey. Turkey, when Erdogan was elected, that was a major change in the trajectory of a very strong secular state in which the military had the heavy hand in maintaining the AKP and Islamist parties out of power, and kicking them out of power regularly. And I thought that with the changes that Erdogan adopted, largely through a process of pursuing membership in the European Union, which while the European Union is a whole other interesting case of its own process of peaceful democratization, incorporating East and Central Europe, fall of the Berlin Wall, all the changes happening in Europe, and then becoming a model and drawing others into its fold. Turkey fell in that stream. And then you saw a very different Erdogan emerge over some years, particularly in the wake of the Arab Spring, where he pursued a policy that on paper was saying the right things in terms of democracy and human rights. I mean, he was very strongly condemning the coup in Egypt, but it was principally driven by his support for the Muslim Brotherhood as a sister-brother party that he could build on and create more of in the region. And we can go on and on about his neo-Ottoman aspirations, etc., that reveals that Erdogan, his desire to stay in power, to create a presidential system, his intolerance for criticism, crackdown on media, academics, other opposition, control of now very dramatically purging of the military and other institutions and doing away with checks on his power. This is a very negative process for Turkey to be going through. But there are other countries that I did consider throwing in the mix, but I felt that they had already gone further enough, not only in their own internal democratization process, but in their adoption of the international system, liberal order. So Mexico, I now fall in that category. Chile, South Korea would be another example, has made tremendous strides, would perfectly fit the thesis, and even is an easy case in that way. And I wanted to take on the harder cases. Because I think these five countries and others like them will serve as the tipping point on whether we go forward with this international liberal order. So that, I hope, explains some of that. Now, I did talk about Brazil a bit. On Indonesia, it's the world's fourth largest country, largest Muslim democracy. We talked about Turkey, whether Islam and democracy are compatible. Well, we have an example, Indonesia. Indonesia has been surprisingly successful, I would say, in getting past some initial periods of great turbulence and on a path where there's been alternation in power. There's an interesting president who really rose from very modest means to become president, so away from the traditional elite in Indonesia, and an ability to respect different religions, even though there is a lot of stress on minority religious populations. I don't mean to dismiss it at all. And because it is a federal system, decentralizing in a way that allows Sharia law to be adopted in different communities, I think could be a flag for concern, although maybe this is the way they have figured out a balance between Islam and democracy that works for them. But the previous president, Yudhoyono, was very vocal in saying how Indonesia shows that you can have both Islamic values and democracy. And I think critically, when Indonesia became an independent state, they debated and decided not to adopt Islam as the national state religion. And I think that was a critical moment compared to some other countries that are struggling with this issue. Tunisia recently is another interesting example that after some initial move in that direction, pulled back from it, including Islamist parties saying, no, we don't want to just impose our religion. South Africa is a case where there has not been alternation in power. The ANC has been in control, and that feeds corruption. It feeds patronage. It feeds a certain kind of cronyism that is prevalent in South Africa. And you see factions within the ANC that are really objecting and getting organized. And ultimately, I think, could lead to the fragmentation of the ANC and other power brokers. And I think that's the key test that South Africa still has to go through. I'm reluctant to say too much about India being a foreigner in your country, but I would say there are certain strengths about Indian democracy. Certainly, in a way, it doesn't belong in this group because it has much longer experience with democracy, but it is the world's largest democracy, so I thought it was very important to include it for its example and its aspirations to be a great power, and yet still struggling with such tremendous problems, but doing it within a democratic context, I thought provides an important example. And I say in the book that it's probably, if India continues on a track of both meeting the aspirations of its people at home in terms of economic and social rights, and its ability to stay on the democratic path, which I have no doubt it will, then really India is the crucible for the future of the international liberal order. So I think it had to be included there. The illiberal tendencies we're seeing now, I think there's a question of leadership and how to manage your supporters in ways that do not become a majoritarian philosophy, and where that gets out of balance, you're going to see some real problems. I think across the board, social media is becoming, it's like any other new technology. It's a tool, and it's used for good and bad purposes. And it is having this effect of inflaming some very bad tendencies, some hate speech that we have in our country, my country, this, I would say, almost extreme understanding of free expression. We tolerate a lot of hate speech in the United States. Other countries see it differently and want to put some controls on that. And I think you can find the right balance where it's appropriate to regulate hate speech. And social media is the place where that needs to happen. And then finally, Dhruva, your question about democratization leading to cosmopolitanism, it's not a natural inevitability, but if you look at democratization as it has played out around the world, and coupled with a global economy, a globalized economy, with much greater trade and open borders, travel, diaspora populations. I mean, India, my God, you have a tremendous number of your compatriots living around the world, sending money back. We live in a much smaller world than we used to, and that creates eye-opening understandings about how other cultures work and exist. And this is what makes me worried about my country. You know, the majority of Americans don't even have passports. A significant number of congressmen have never left the United States. I mean, we are not a very cosmopolitan country from that standard. But nonetheless, I think overall the trends are toward greater globalization leads toward more liberal views about the world. This counter pressure is, and I think there's a reaction going on around the world, almost an identity crisis, where people are returning back to some tribal, ethnic, religious, nationalist identities because they see this sea of new faces, new trends that they can't keep up with. Technology is the driver of that. And I think that's the moment we're living in right now. How do we get through it? You know, we have to keep reinforcing first principles. And I think democracies are particularly good at doing that because we practice it every day.
Well, why don't we take a few questions and comments from people? They can be either questions or comments, but please keep them short. And if they're questions, please try and direct them either at Ted or Ambassador Reggie. Gentleman in the back there first. And if you could please introduce yourself, actually.
Yeah, I did. Thank you for a very illuminating presentation. I've been, in fact, thinking to write a review of your book, very fascinating book. I'm Niranjan Sahu, Senior Fellow with Observer Research Foundation. And incidentally, I work for a forum by Carnegie, Rising Democracy Network, where I keep meeting a lot of scholars working on democracy. So that's where my interest came on this fascinating book. I have a comment and then a question. Comment first. I think choosing 5 democracies, as Ambassador Reddy said, I think these 5 democracies are very unique. In fact, those who are raising doubts about Turkey, I think it's too early. It's a very resilient society, and Turkey's democratic record, in fact, would improve. And one authoritarian regime is not going to wind up, all the gains, in several decades. So I think it's too negative way sort of thinking. Having said this, on India, especially, I think. A lot of people, whenever in fact we assemble in different part of the world and talk about India's record in terms of supporting democracy. I won't use the word promotion because that is something won't be acceptable here. Strengthening or building democracy in other periphery. See, our problem, every time we explain, that we are in a very difficult geography. It's most of our energy and diversion will be always to balance between Russia and China. And with China, if you see 2 examples, like, we went to backing the junta in Burma and the Nepalese, monarchy is largely basically to counter basically Chinese threat. So it's security interest that actually matters in our sort of regions. And then we are also the kind of India's size in the region in South Asia, especially the super big size, and the feeling of the smaller countries, the sort of problem it problematizes most of our intention. Even honest intention we made with Bangladesh or even with Maldives has actually backfired and put us in troubled water. So it would be always a difficult thing if India actually overtly come out with any sort of democratic support. It can, of course, do a lot of things. It's doing on institution building, strengthening rule of law, election monitoring, or helping conduct election, technical assistance. Those dimensions we can actually do a lot.
Values will always.
Yeah. So I just said.
And your question.
Yeah. So promoting that, even promoting also at the regional level in the SAARC also. India will be, I think, for a long time a sort of backbencher. Even SAARC Charter of Human Rights or democracy charter is something started by other countries in SAARC, not India. So that itself shows where actually we will be in next 1 or 2 decades. Second thing about something I wanted to ask.
If you could ask a question.
Yeah, the question part. Actually, if you see last decade, not decade, I would say Obama administration's policy towards democratic sort of support, democracy promotion has actually declined drastically. And scholars like Thomas Karathan, a lot of them have been writing on this. This has actually net effect on many of the countries, in terms of support, aid, and a lot of things that were happening in the early 90s during Bush administration and later on has actually declined drastically, and that has a net effect. So if this is the situation, and then the situation like Brexit and right wing and left wing kind of xenophobic things emerging, and democracy is also facing a sort of pushback, as a lot of scholars have been saying. So how do you actually how do you figure out these 5 countries, and in which 2 or 3 of them have serious they are in serious trouble, like Brazil, Turkey are in serious trouble today. So how do you expect this rising democracy to actually pitch in and fill the vacuum?
Thank you so much. I'm Salma Babu, Professor for European Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Ted, you gave a very interesting presentation. I think I'll use that as an appetizer to read the book now. But a very fascinating set of hypotheses to begin with. Because, as you yourself said, the countries is a strange grouping. And the assumption when you put a grouping like that is you do come down to a lowest common denominator, because it doesn't, the idea of democracy and how entrenched it is into the polity and into the system could be addressed from the point of rollback to what was before. In the Indian case, the point is we'll take it after independence. There's been no rollback. Turkey, I have doubts. I have a friend who's currently an academic. She says she's in the US, has to get back. She doesn't know when she can get out again. So the whole Gulen movement and all of it, for those who are familiar with it. So it's 3 quick issues. One is on, apart from the selection, and it's an alphabet soup, so one can pick any 5 or any 6. I want to know, when you're talking about these democracies, and you said about the buy-in to the system. Now the assumption, and that's a very heavy thing, you show the UN flag over there, but the assumption that the order is liberal, and the order is static. I have big problems with that. Because, for me, I'm a Europeanist by training. For me, it just struck me, it's 200 years since the Congress of Vienna. It's 1815. We're now in 2016. A whole 200 years of building of a particular kind of assumption in a strand of Western values located in the Westphalian state system has managed to, grow and go around the world. So the West has managed to create what we would call as very ideal socializing units, subunits around the world. Now that we all socialize and we speak the same language, the problem comes is why do we talk of a buy-in? It means that you are like us, but you still have to buy in. And so what is the purpose of the liberal order? For whom does the liberal order stand? And from whose point of view? I think that has to be asked and addressed squarely. Because if you're still talking in 2017, 200 years after Congress of Vienna, after a 45 international order, where we're looking at what do we do with this global system that has been produced in 1951, then the question is why the North and the South, and the East and the West? Because as your indexes pointed out, the buy-in to the liberalization and all of it has meant, even in all of these 5, but even in the others, a growing, disparity, a growing poverty, and all of this is continuing to persist. So I think that would also, is the entire effort then an output maintenance effort? You want polities to become democracies to maintain a particular order created at a particular point in time. How do you take it forward? My idea is that what happens to a genuine partnership if you're all a world of democracies? How those distinctions you spoke about, narrow identity. So we're not escaping it. So we've become socialized, we've learned to speak the same language, and when you ask that, can I sit on the high table, you said, no, you're not ready yet. You'll never never be ready, I mean, for the rest of the world. So from where I stand and see is just one point, and I'll hand over the microphone, is that the production of values is only to sustain an order which serves an interest, a level few. And if that's the order, then it will be challenged.
Ted, I mean, there are two questions addressed. Do you want to take those two? And
Sure, because they're very
big questions.
It's a very big question. I also want to hear Ambassador Redding, including on the internet, social media governance issues. But just to try to quickly respond to some of these really fundamental questions. So I guess on this last point, what we've seen in the last, let's take since World War II, because I think that really has been the birth of real forward movement in terms of the international order, with the creation of all kinds of institutions that have real teeth, that have real meaning, that have created a certain semblance of order in that post-45 world. There's this ongoing clash, which is fundamental to the Westphalian system we live in, which is the clash between sovereignty and human rights. And I think, the long-standing view of most countries that you shall not intervene in my internal affairs was broken long ago, in part through the leadership of India. India was one of the leading voices, not only in the creation of the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the impact it had here in India's own democratization process, but also in South Africa, where India is one of the loudest voices for breaking through to that principle of sovereignty and human rights, and said, we do have a moral claim to speak out against apartheid in South Africa. Yes, our own nationals are being affected and discriminated against in South Africa, but it goes beyond that. All human beings should be entitled to . So the basic norm was established by many countries, not just India, in the global south, ironically. And the tables have turned over time, that as these countries have reached their own levels of development, they don't want a strong international system interfering with their internal affairs. But this is the battle, day after day. If you look at the way this debate happens at the UN Human Rights Council, you have a group of states that cling on to this principle. The UN has no business saying anything about human rights in any specific countries. Well, over time, the votes go the other way, in fact. Vote after vote actually does allow international monitoring, scrutiny, commissions of inquiry that lead to the International Criminal Court. The Commission of Inquiry on North Korea, for example, really was a breakthrough example of how we have created tools in the international system to do that kind of monitoring, investigation, fact-finding, and ultimately, potentially, criminal court. Now, the criminal court, as you see, is not going very well. That's because states are not cooperating in different ways. But we have seen international prosecution, the most recent one, Chad, Habre's prosecution in Senegal, referencing international law. I mean, these are important steps. Too slow, yes. Incremental, yes. But I think you could draw a line and say there's been progress. So buying into the liberal order, what does that mean? I think, at the end of the day, the liberal order depends on, if you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says sovereignty and the authority of governments depend on the popular will of the people, as expressed through free and fair elections and full respect for human rights. That's what sovereignty actually is supposed to mean in the international system. How many countries, well, only 50-some% actually have free and fair elections. So we're a long, long ways from even fulfilling the basic norms that all these governments agreed to back in 1947, I guess, 49, in those years. All of which, of course, was a result of war and devastation. And I think if you look at trends of violence, we do have an uptick right now, but overall the trends are down, including intrastate conflict and intrastate conflict. So I think the international order has delivered some sense of coherence and stability that allows countries to develop their goals, their economies, in ways that are more positive than negative. That's the best I can do with that.
On the question of the Obama administration taking a step back in democracy.
Yeah, overall, that is, I would say that is true. We're seeing declining budgets in this area. I think they have done certain stepping up in other areas. For example, protection of civil society has been one of President Obama's signature campaigns, putting a lot of effort into that. But I think there's also a sense, and if you've read some of the stories about now Obama is finishing up, he's giving more interviews, and there was a very important interview he gave to a journalist from the Atlantic magazine, very long, but he talks about burden sharing and feeling that the rest of the world is not doing enough to join us. We don't want to be the only ones out there, and I think you saw that in Libya, unfortunately, where leading from behind, get out as soon as we can, and left a huge mess as a result. So we I think are slowly learning that we can't be nation builders. It's too hard to do, and it's too expensive. And sometimes it's that realist impulse that's been driving the Obama policy. And we see it in Syria. I mean, what more dramatic example can you have? And regretful, I think, that we've watched that situation just get worse and worse and worse, and now having dramatic effects in the neighboring countries, in Turkey, in Europe, and guess what? One of the candidates in the United States using it for his own campaign. So that was a real, I think, lost opportunity that we did not act on what would have been the right humanitarian and human rights impulses to try to at least calm down the conflict there, and instead we've let it run out of control. And I think that shows, proves the point that the international order does need to act sometimes when it faces these kinds of disasters.
Yes. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Yes. Well, what struck me really is that there is actually an ongoing struggle today in the world on what form a new international order, liberal or not, should take. And I think Salma's point is very valid. Do you have to accept a Western democracy's concept as a superior goal that rising democracies have to aspire to? Or do we accept that we are now trying to create a new world order in which different points of view have to be given equal weightage and balance? And when China, in India, and other developing countries, feel they have a legitimate right to a rightful place on a high table, either they will be given that, take that, seize that, or you will have to recreate the system altogether. That's really the issue. And since you did mention the internet, I was just saying today as I was coming up in the lift with my friend that I'm so happy not to talk about the internet for a change. We seem to inevitably come back to it. In a sense, the internet governance debate which is going on reflects the real struggle in the virtual world. It's a mirror image of the struggle I'm talking about of taking your legitimate place at the high table in the real world also applies to the virtual world. And when China has the largest, and India has the second largest number of internet users in the world, can you argue against the fact that these countries want to have a say in how the internet will be governed, how standards will be framed, and the huge power of cyberspace is really creating such a borderless world that many of these concepts of nation states and how we function as nations are going to become defunct in the future.
I mean, for the benefit of a lot of people here who may not be so familiar with some of the internet governance, do China and India today have more in common on internet governance than either do with the West? Or?
No, I would say that with India's open acceptance of the multi-stakeholder system and saying that we need a multi-stakeholder system, it cannot be resolved in a purely multilateral system, like say a UN-led agreement, I think it brings it closer to the Western point of view on that. But where I think China and India do have convergence is where they say that governments have to be the leaders on all matters to do with cyberspace when it comes to national security. And I think as recent events have proved, it's not that far from the US position anymore. Because when you look at the Apple and Facebook standoff, that's exactly what it was about. That when you can talk as much as you like about freedom of the internet, you can talk as much as you like about privacy issues, but when it actually comes to the crunch, and you want to actually get to the bottom of who was behind the terrorist attack, these concerns seem to be set aside by all countries, not necessarily just by China and India. China, I think, is playing the game in a very interesting way because they espouse the multi-stakeholder model insofar as to generate business opportunities, but when it comes to points of social unrest, which they fear in their own country, or the question of whether government should have the say-so with certain aspects, there they will espouse the multilateral. I think that's the fundamental difference between India and China's position.
We'll take another round of questions, but if you could please keep them short, and again, there can be statements or questions, but please keep them simple. So the lady here, and then you two over here.
Hi, I'm Portia Conrad, and my question, thank you for the presentation, Ted. The 7 thematic areas of convergence that you have brought out, I mean, how do you see it different from the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, which are very general for all developing countries? Thank you.
There are about 2 people over. We'll come to you in the 2 block. Through.
It's a very short question. My name is Sonia Gupta, and I am from Latin American Studies at the Jamia Millia Islamia University. I thought that the very idea of rising democracies has inherent in it a kind of linearity. You're rising to reach a certain point, while perhaps a best way to look at the limitations of liberal democracy today would be to see it within the so-called developed democracies. I mean, I teach Spanish, and I can see the case of Spain, 2 elections and no government yet. So perhaps the entire crisis of liberal democracy needs to be addressed, looking at the dominant models that there are, and the fact, as Jacques Rancière has said, that there will always be a tension between democracy as an exercise of shared thought and action, and democracy as appropriated by the state. So in other words, we are talking about democracy as a representational democracy, electoral democracy, or participatory democracy. Several models from Latin America, for example, today are trying to redefine democracy. So I was wondering what your take on that is.
Thank you. I'm Sanjeev Srivastava from IDSA. My question is that it appears that international community, the nations in the international community is becoming more and more inward looking. And at the same time, also it appears that they are scared of losing their distinct identities as they become more and more globalized and interconnected with the world. And that is the kind of phenomenon we are witnessing at the moment, and you also mentioned in your presentation. My question is that as there is 5 democracies which you are talking about, become more and more assertive and become more responsible to play their roles, will they also be asserting their distinct identities, whatever identities they have, like India, Turkey or Brazil, at the same time? So this is the question I would like to pose to you. And what kind of world we are going to face? And that's what my question would be. I just want to know your insights on that.
If you could pass it to the gentleman behind you, and then
Thank you, Ted, for a wonderful presentation. My name is Bharat Vaklu. I work for Lockheed Martin in the US. My question really is that does your book address the fact that it is leaders who can transform a democracy from being a constitutional democracy to one that actually degenerates into a majoritarian democracy, or one where the rule of tribal law will suddenly become more prevalent? So I'm curious because I've seen that many democracies that you refer to actually demonstrate a sliding of constitutional values, and it's often driven by the fact that you have a very powerful leader, or you have a few powerful leaders who seem to be able to, emasculate the institutions that are supposed to actually keep the democracy alive. So I'm just curious, has that been addressed? And I see that happening not just in our neighborhood, but it's happening around the world. So I'm really curious about what might be the way forward for us.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Kunal Kishore. I'm from UNODC, a UN organization that works on drugs and transnational organized crime. Talking of the international liberal order that you use quite often, I feel, in my view, it also calls for a bigger role for the UN. And of late, I think the grouping that you refer to also interprets UN to simply being confined to nomenclatures like SDG or MDG, and sometimes to Security Council related roles only. So, two questions actually. The developed world, or let's say the US and likewise similar other countries who play a bigger role in shaping up a lot of things in the UN platform. What role are they playing in terms of also strengthening, giving more teeth? Because a lot has changed within the UN also in terms of how we operate. And secondly, how do you help the grouping that you're talking about also interpret the role of UN from a more convening perspective rather than limited to only Security Council or let's say, the SDGs?
I think a bunch of those questions. We have, I think, 3 other people I saw with hands up, so we do one last round after that. But maybe if you can address some of those questions more specific to you, and then perhaps we can do the last round.
Well, I'll just quickly go through them in order. So the 7 areas I outlined are meant to be areas that, yes, there are already various initiatives underway at the international level, but that are still in formation or still require an extra effort to really prove their value. So if you take, for example, right to education, particularly for women and girls, all the social science shows that that is a very wise investment of public money, that it leads to improved family incomes, better health outcomes, less violence, less conflict. It's a no-brainer. But we're still a long way from meeting the targets that have been outlined, not only in the Millennium Development Goals, which, by the way, were just targeted to less developed countries, but also the targets in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is affecting all states have accepted the sustain. So that's the big distinction between those two. Or you take the area of business and human rights. There was a lot of work put into a set of guiding principles on better respect for human rights in the business sector, and suddenly Ecuador and South Africa, joined by India, voted to establish a treaty, or to begin a negotiating process for a treaty that would regulate for the first time ever in international law transnational corporations and their responsibility to protect human rights. This is a very contentious issue, and it falls along north-south lines. But because the private sector has grown so tremendously around the world, it does demand attention by the international community. And so I think that's an area that remains under debate, and I thought it required some attention. So the limits, there was 2 questions related to the limits of liberal democracy and illiberalism falling away from constitutional values. So I think if you look at the diffusion of power in any society, overall the trends have shown toward greater dispersion of power. And this is really kind of built into a democratic system that allows for checks and balances on executive authority. And this is what I'm meaning by liberal in the classical sense, that that there are executive state powers that need to be restrained in order to protect individual rights, human dignity, etc. So we have vertical accountability and horizontal accountability, through vertical through elections and horizontal through courts and the media and legislatures, etc. When those systems are no longer functioning or being cut away, eroded over and over time, then I think you do get to this illiberal hybrid. There are many different adjectives for this kind of democracy. And I'm doing research right now that looks at the linkages between democracy and security. And the research shows that it is in this middle tier of hybrid democracies that actually are the most vulnerable to insecurity, to different kinds of conflict, violence, crime, etc. So the argument should be we need to strengthen democracies, because actually the stronger you are as a democracy, the better security outcomes you get. Now there are exceptions to that general rule, but I think that is another reason why democracy, as a general matter, is both has normative value, intrinsic to what it stands for, which is to me critically about human rights and human dignity, but it also has instrumental value as a form of government that, as Winston Churchill put it, is better than all the others. It's imperfect. Democracy will always be imperfect, always, but it's better than the others. And I think history proves that. I mean, if you look at the way human rights are treated in authoritarian systems, do we really think that's a better system? Participatory democracy. So if you take the Cuban example, Cuba says, we're a democracy, and our people have a chance to express themselves. We control how they express themselves. We don't allow any free media. We don't allow any real free and fair elections. But we call that a participatory democracy. Well, to me, that's just a manipulation of the term, really, to be honest about it. So we can't forget some of our core definitions here. A bigger role for the UN and the Rising Five. I'm all for it. I mean, the UN has proven itself to be a much more present and capable and universal actor. So when you're walking around the world and someone shows up with a UN flag, you're much more likely to get a good reception than if you're coming from the United States or any other individual country or even some regional organizations. It does have the value of universality. And I can go on, but there's something in the human rights field, a new dynamic called the Universal Periodic Review, which is garnering 100% participation from all member states. It's unheard of in the international human rights system. Every country shows up every 4 years and they go through their report card. And every other state can criticize them, make recommendations. Then the state accepts those recommendations, some of them, not all of them. And you have a report card, and you have civil society there to say, you can do better on this, you can do better on that. And because it's a peer review process, it's more accepted by states. Now you could say it's too weak, but it's an example, I think, where if it's done right, you're creating an ecosystem of peer pressure and self-reinforcement toward liberal values. And I think that's a good example of what the UN can do. The final point is on burden sharing. This is one of the complaints of the West, that the rising powers want more power, but they're not writing the checks. They're not contributing anywhere near what needs to be contributed to make the international system work.
Amanda, we have 3 other hands up, no, sorry, unfortunately we don't have enough time. I have one here. Yes.
My name is Guru, a retired foreign service officer. Just a bit of an anomaly that I noticed really. And I think that brings in also how valid is this concept of the international liberal order. If you look at the West Asia and the Gulf, you have a curious situation there that the monarchies seem to be more stable as compared to the states which had taken a path towards more elective systems of government. So how do you reconcile that? Thank you.
Gentleman here, where you have
Yeah, Bhaskar Balakrishna, former ambassador. I was ambassador to Cuba. So I would say, there's a lot of discussion about development. Now, many people argue that democracy is not an end in itself. It's a means to good governance. So in this context now, it's very valuable the example you've given about the progress in the MDGs of the 5 rising democracies. It would be more validated if you could compare it with the similar analysis for China, Cuba and others, whether they have done as well or less well or better. The other thing which needs to be done is, because when you argue with government of a one-party state about democracy, the answer comes back that, well, we are delivering development, we are delivering good governance, and they point out to a number of flaws in democracies. For example, the influence of money, the lack of access to the political system, and so on. So we need to have a quality index for democracies, which takes into account all the different parameters. How are elections financed? How are political parties regulated? What is the influence of big money? And so on. There seems to be no quantitative quality index to assess democracies. And I think this would be useful. Thank you.
Finally, you've been very patient.
Hi, I'm Yash Singh. Very interesting talk. So like you said, the majority of the world is not democratic or liberal. And you said in the short term, the trends are negative, they're not looking good currently. So like Sir said, how do you think countries like China and other current powers, for example, like with Brexit happening in the UK, the EU is in a mess right now with internal immigration and the refugee issue, and has been in a mess for a while now. So how do you think, what does the trend look like in the short term, say the next 5 to 10 years? Do you think, are there any specific interventions or solutions that you have in mind for these 5 nations, as well as major powers like China and democracies as well, like Western Europe, including the UK? And could you, if yes, could you give specific examples of how governments can actually start punching the right weight? Like you said, they're not doing enough. So, I think specific intervention example. And can you discuss that? Thanks.
Before I turn to Ted, Professor Reddy, either in this round of questions or comments on the previous one, was there anything that you wanted to address?
Well, actually, I do have 2 points I wanted to address, but they're actually, one is a suggestion to Ted. That one is, when you talked about foreign policy in the rising democracies, you said there's a swing in these countries between interest-based strategic autonomy and erratic concern for democratic progress and human rights. Now, my point is, don't you think the swing or this balance between these 2 extremes exists in all countries and not necessarily only in the 5 rising democracies? And the second thing is a suggestion for a new book, Ted, and I hope you take it on board. I think you should examine why, when we have a G20, why isn't that taken as the only functioning body, and why does the G7 continue to meet?
Okay.
All right, well, thank you all for these great questions. I'll try my best to answer them in a little bit of time we've left. West Asia monarchies. Well, this is big, raging debate. Why is there an Arab exception to the democratic trends we've seen around the world? It used to be that you'd say Latin America can never have democracy. They're not ready for it. They're not appropriate. Their culture, their history, their religion. Well, we've seen a different story over time. I think the challenge is that you have a variety of states in that part of the world that have practiced a system of governance that is controlled and therefore a certain level of stability. And that's the price people are willing to pay for what's perceived as the chaos of democracy. And I think that you hear from China as well, that argument. And I think it's true, history shows that there is a period of instability when democracy begins unfolding. And that period of instability can last decades, and sometimes shorter periods. But that's why this process of strengthening democracy is so important. If you live in that hybrid place, it's not a good outcome. And I think
there's a famous article by Mansfield and Snyder, right? The two political scientists. It was in the 70s, 80s that came out, which basically marked this trend and found a sort of dipping curve between stability on one end, stability on the other, and instability in the middle as countries democratize.
So then that raises the question of how do you reconcile some of these different regimes? I think when you think about, I think about it in terms of universal human rights, right? All states have accepted a certain definition. It means both economic and social rights and political and civil rights. And over the many years of the Cold War, there was a very strong cleavage between those two areas of human rights, with the West saying what matters most is civil and political rights and freedom as we understand it. And the communist Soviet Union states saying, no, what matters, Cuba, etc., economic and social delivery of those rights. And unfortunately, it was one versus the other instead of finding a comprehensive, integrated whole. Now I think we're past those debates, I would hope, and that there's a much better appreciation on both sides of, yes, it needs to be a comprehensive approach, including in the United States. We've now moved off of our position, which was we never vote in favor of issues like right to food or right to health at the UN. Ridiculous. But now we're supporting those concepts. And you see universal health care as a concept being promoted in the United States. Similarly, in many of the states that were normally authoritarian, being willing to talk about transparency, accountability, participation, civil society, rule of law as key principles of governance. And this is being accepted more and more in more and more states. So I think that is encouraging that there might be this general convergence. Now, the short-term trends, unfortunately, are not going so well. So you asked some very good specific questions about, okay, now what? What do you do about it? And I think, first and foremost, it starts from democracies looking within. I think you do have to come to the table as a strong and confident and performing entity. But who asked the question about quality of democracy indices? They do exist, and they're getting more sophisticated. There's something called VDEM, which I would suggest you look at, which has an incredibly comprehensive set of indicators to judge the quality of democracy in countries around the world, and going back now decades and covering most countries in the world. And I think, again, over time trends with lots of back and forth go in a more progressive direction. But I think these countries that we're talking about need to decide whether they're going to be net contributors to the international order, which I would argue they have benefited from over these many years, or if they're going to be takers. And I think, this is the argument you're hearing in the United States with Trump saying all these countries in NATO are just right, or Asia Pacific, South Korea, Japan, they're not paying their fair share, which I think is largely unfair, but nonetheless, this is something that at times, this is a bipartisan issue. It's not just Trump that's raising those questions. So I think at some point there has to be a maturity and a willingness to contribute. And by the way, I'm not saying they don't already. There are many good examples. You mentioned, or someone else, what's happened, what India's own record is in the region, and this goes to your point about swing states. Yes, all states are interest-based approaches, but they have different degrees of willingness to actually promote universal values and norms and actually put money and blood on the line. And so I think that's where a distinction. Now, peacekeeping is the last thing. Peacekeeping is a great example where some very important states, including India, have really made important contributions toward peacekeeping. And I think that just shows that there is an international order. It has liberal values at its heart on paper. In practice, it is far, far from meeting that test. But the standards are there, and it's a question of, in terms of moving it forward, I think it's going to require a critical mass of public opinion that's expressed through democratic means that push governments in that direction toward convergence and not away from each other.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks especially to Ambassador Reddy and Ted for coming and speaking. I believe Ambassador Reddy has to rush to the airport after this, so we have to wind up. Thanks all again for coming. Hope you can come to more events here at Brookings India. And please join me in thanking our speakers and in joining me for some refreshments outside. We have some coffee, tea, and snacks. Thanks again.